Alright, Gamer Bears, it is time for part 5 of Unused Content in Games, and part 5 for Mega Man X2 Unused Content. And today we're going to look at sprite changes, as well as weapons and items that went unused in Mega Man X2. So let's start off with the sprite changes, but before we truly begin, I'd like to ask those of you, if you enjoy this video at any point in time, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's for free and you can always change your mind later. So, starting off, the early prototype recycles the boss icons from the first game. Well, the icons in the later prototype and final game changed the nebulous skull to a more distinct Sigma emblem. And here's what that looks like. Now, the Sigma emblem obviously is a lot better to show off that, hey, you're about to fight some Mavericks. And here's what it looks like in the final game. Alright, the final ride chaser sprite adds a proper edge to the front of the seat. And here's a closer look at the prototype one. And at the final one. The one in the later prototype as well, it looks like. Alright, X. While dashing, the prongs on X's second armor helmet are longer in the early prototype. This is the only sprite that has the longer prongs. They were shortened to match the helmet's design and the rest of X's animations. And here's a closer look at that. Honestly, I think I prefer the slightly longer prongs. It looks slightly more dynamic, if you will. Alright, enemies. The clan detail is one tile taller than it should be in the prototype. After it's destroyed, the base of the tail is destroyed too, leading to this strange sprite. Here's what that looks like. Alright, the Barrett Last Star Laser are twice as big in both prototypes than they are in the final game. More like long than big, I'd say. They're definitely more vertical than this circular-shaped one that we see in the final game. Alright, the barrier attackers have a warmer palette in the early prototype. Here's a closer look at that. It is a slightly brighter, like, purple color than the one we get in the final game. Though I think I prefer the darker purple. Alright, the Bleckers is missing its eye in the early design. This eyeball right over here, I guess, is what it's talking about. And let's have a closer look at that. Maybe initially I wasn't going to have an eyeball. Or just little yellow dot sitting there. I guess they call it an eyeball, for whatever reason. The larger Crocopper's back was widened to cover up more of the smaller Crocopper's platform, while the small Crocopper's back was slimmed up a pixel or two. It's a little bit noticeable, I'd say. Alright, here's a closer look at it. I mean, if the picture's going to be that small, might as well just see it from here. And here's the final version. The final game only stores the left Crocopper's hopper spring in its tile set, and then mirrors the right side, losing a small amount of asymmetry in the spring's shine to free up space and RAM in the ROM. Alright, closer look at that. It's animated even. Look at that. And here's a closer look at the final version. Alright, in the early prototype, the installer blocks animate while they move, but simply explode when they're destroyed. In the later versions, the installer blocks aren't animated. The space taken out by those tiles is instead used for debris or debris. Alright, here's a closer look at that. And it's actually animated here. That we don't see that in the final game. Actually, this should have stayed in the final game, in my opinion. Would have been more immersive. Alright, Flizzers has a slightly different design in the prototype. It has two small beady eyes instead of one large eye. And that purple thing that charges it up is a long tube instead of three small spheres. Its shining animation is also different. In the early design, it covers up most of the brain, but in the final version, the shine completely envelops the brain. These changes were made to reduce the size of Flizzer's tiles set in the ROM and RAM. The redesigned version appears in the later prototype, but the horizontal variant actually retains the beady-eyed design for a single frame. This was fixed in the final game, which also brightens up Flizzer's metal base. Alright, let's give that a look. A little too small for anybody to really see. Let's just see it from here. Yeah, you can see those little beady eyes there. Kind of looks like a little bug beetle or something inside of this crystal. Alright, here's it sideways. Alright, and here's the later prototype one. Yeah, you can still see that for a single frame. I see what they're talking about. Just probably removed it just so it wouldn't look like a little bug was still in there. And here's the final version. With that little animation error fixed. The fuzzer's beams are darker in the prototype and lack a bit of detail in the middle. There's a closer look. I think I prefer the slightly darker look than the slightly brighter one we have in the final game. Our driver has a dull palette in the earlier prototype. There was also a blinking animation that was taken out to save space in the ROM/RAM, and here's a closer look at that. This driver's enemy kind of looks a little duller in color too. Right here it is in the final game. Alright, we've seen this in the last 3 parts of the Battle Wheel Gator stage back in part 3. The Tyrannos enemies can come in one of 4 colors based on its subtype, one of which is never used: Pro Action Replay, Par, Code, that code right there. In the early prototype, it makes the first Tyrannos and Wheel Gator stage use the 4th palette. This feature is in the later prototype, but every Tyrannos subtype is set to 00, which is the default palette. The final game removes this feature entirely, but the palettes are still in the final ROM, and here's a closer look at all 3 of the unused colors. Alright, and we have the final game. That just uses the first one. To be fair, all these look pretty good, but in platformers, if you're going to have an enemy that's the same as another enemy, but it's a different color, you should make it do something different. So that's likely why it was removed, since there'd be no point in changing its color other than for aesthetics. If it doesn't do anything different, just the same as the default version. Alright, that Super Male generator's hatch changed from 2 sample plates to a dome, and the base was redrawn to match, and here's what that looks like. More space saving. Fun! The Weather Crystal and Water Sponge stage have 3 different states of disrepair in the early prototype, but only one in the later prototype and final game. Here's a closer look at that. So I guess as you damaged it, it would have gotten more and more damaged over time. But in the final game, they just stuck with what looks like the middle animation that we had before. This one right over here. It looks kind of similar, but it's not the same. Alright, gigantic Mechanolite CF0. The turned leg sprite doesn't properly connect with the foot sprite in the early prototype. The machinery in the gap of the foot was extended upwards to fill in that gap, and here's a closer look. You gotta see it right over here, it doesn't connect with the rest of the foot. But that was fixed. Alright, so the Master Sword is a wireframe. Chop register. The design for Chop Register was changed in the later prototype. I prefer the final version. The blue hilt actually makes nice contrast. To a more asymmetrical blade with a thinner hilt and handle. Then, it was changed again to incorporate elements for both designs. The blade and hilt are modeled after the earlier prototype's design, but the blade is shorter, while the handle matches the later prototype, but the handle is longer. In both prototypes, the Chop Register's hilt and handles are the same color as the blade, and here's a closer look at that. Alright, there's another unused sprite right over here, where the blade looks a bit fatter at the top. Alright, here's the final version. Alright, Morph Moth. Morph Moth's cocoon turns an odd green color when it's burned in the early prototype. Most likely a little coding mistake. Maybe not a coding mistake, but it could be a sprite mistake, since it was changed. Either that or this could have been what he looked like after getting hit with the speed burner. I don't know. But it's better that they went with this in the final game. Our Morph Moth's wings aren't properly synced up with his lift in the early design. In later versions, he properly drops when his wings are retracted, and raises after flapping his wings. The final animation also adds a few more details to his flying animation, like his right leg and both hands bobbing as he floats, which don't seem to be here in the prototype design. I guess it just adds more to the effect that he's actually, in the air and flapping his wings. Alright, his final design. Our Morphmoth's left antenna is usually 1 pixel lower in the early prototype. Yeah, you're totally going to notice that here, but let's take a closer look anyways. By a single pixel, that's very small in terms of sprites. This is the one animation that's an exception. The later prototype adds an error here by placing 2 transparent pixels on Morphmoth's left knee. And this wasn't fixed in the final game. A closer look at this sprite when he gets hit. Alright, here it is again. Alright. Standard antenna realignment in the final game, but the final game also erases one of the pixels on Morphmoth's left arm. Alright, here's a closer look at the prototype sprite. And the final sprite. Our Magnus Centipede's palette is a smidge brighter in the early prototype. Not very fitting for a ninja. It does look slightly darker here. I mean, he's already got a pretty bright color scheme as is, and he's supposed to be a ninja-based Reploid. Don't think he's accomplishing that too well, personally, but whatever. I mean, pink, all these bright blues and purples and greens. Yeah, he's not hiding from anything anytime soon. Our Overdrive Ostrich's outline color is almost imperceptibly lighter in the prototypes. And here's what it looks like. Alright, Bubble Crab. The difference in Bubble Crab's palette, though, is obvious. Yeah, it does look like... He looks a little more orange than red in his prototypes, right? And here's what it looks like in the final game. Alright, Wheelgator. Wheelgator is a darker green outline in both prototypes. The final game changes this to the standard dark gray color. While Wheelgator's sprite is very buggy in the early prototype, with many layering errors that lead to the transparent pixels where there shouldn't be any. As the sprite below will demonstrate, they clearly had problems with all the individual parts that make up Wheelgator's body. And here's a closer look at his sprite. The later prototype. And the final game, where he looks a little bit darker. Our Wheelgator's diving sprite has different errors in each version of the game. The first set of spikes on Wheelgator's tails are glitched in both prototypes, while Wheelgator's left leg has a transparent line through it in the later prototype only. In the in-between diving frames, the upper right spike on Wheelgator's shoulder is correct in both prototypes, but is miscolored solid black in the final version. And here's what it looks like. Later prototype. And the final game. The most obvious error is in this frame of the early prototype, where one of the tiles in Wheelgator's collar is incorrectly flipped vertically. Alright, here's a closer look at that. You can kind of see it right around here where that gap is. The yellow bands on Wheelgator's left arm is thicker in the early prototype, and there is a priority issue with Wheelgator's mouth, which makes it look like he's eating his own tail. Yeah, it kind of does. You can kind of see it right over here. The interior of Wheelgator's right shoulder wheel is brighter in the final version. Here's a closer look at this sprite of him eating his own tail. Must be tasty. Let me know. Not a question of the day, but has anybody ever eaten an alligator before? I really want to try that someday, but slightly off topic. Alright, the early prototype has a unique frame of when Wheelgetters jumps out of the oil that has his arm held back. Later versions recycle the arm position from his falling animation, and here's what it looks like. Wheelgetter's falling animation uses a different head graphic in the early prototype, while later versions recycle the head graphic from the jumping animation. His torso and hands are lowered to his legs in the final version. Here is a closer look. The first frame has priority issues in the later prototype, and the leg extends one more pixel to the right. The second frame just has priority issues. Alright, here's a closer look at this collection of sprites. Kinda looks like he's jumping like a frog in this shot. Alright, stand priority issues and armband changes. Possibly interesting. Alright, here's a closer look at these sprites. Kinda wish these were all lumped together, but they didn't do that. It's really subtle differences, so I don't think I'm going to click on those just to make this a little faster. Priorities, standard priority issues, I already said that. Our standard priority issues possibly interesting. I guess I'll read it anyways. But yeah, these are the bullets that Wheelgetter shoots out when he eats an X-Buster shot. The Silk Shot, Sonic Slicer, or Magnum Mine, respectively, and here's what it looks like. That's very hard to see, so let's just go over here where they're a little bit bigger. And notice how they're in a bit of a different order, too. Alright, here's what they look like in the final game. These are the bullets that... I already read that. In the early prototype, the graphics from the X-Buster, the Silk Shot, and Magnum Mine are switched around. The Magnum Mine graphic is a strange orb that doesn't seem to fit in with the rest of the graphics. I wonder how they could tell that's even the Magnum Mine one. Oh well. In the later prototypes, the graphics are almost complete, but the Silk Shot bullet is now glitched. I think it's this one right over here they're talking about. It's still using the old tile IDs from the early prototype, which is now an unrelated part of Wheelgetter's body. The final game adds a new Silk Shot bullet graphic to Wheelgetter's tool set, or tile set. Crystal Snail. Crystal Snail's second frame is glitched starting in the later prototype. In that version, his tile set was reduced in size by removing duplicate files. Unfortunately, they deleted too many tiles, so one of the tiles of his legs in the second ducking frame was deleted, and here's what that looks like. And here's what it looks like in the later prototype and final version. The same issue can be seen in the first frame of Crystal Snail's mid-air uncurling animation. The tile that makes up part of Crystal Snail's body, the one to the right of Crystal Snail's head in the early prototype, was replaced with solid black in the later prototype. Here's a closer look. Our Crystal Snail's left foot no longer uses mirrored tiles in its shooting animation in the final version. Our Crystal Snail's left antenna is a pixel lower in the early prototype. Woo! Alright, small difference, so here's a closer look at it. And the final game. Alright, the snail man's right arm is 1 pixel higher in the final version. Fascinating. It's slightly noticeable, but not by much. In the first frame, Crystal Snail's right antenna is shaded differently in the early prototype, while in the second frame, his left leg is thicker. Intriguing. Yeah, you can tell whoever wrote this is like, yeah, does this really need to be that much changed? Like, does this really need to be a separate sprite? You might as well have just made it the same sprite. It's so minor. Maybe because I made some sprite animations with other animations? I don't know. Or sprite animation errors, I should say. His left foot was moved 1 pixel to the right. Wow. Alright, just goes to look at that. Since these are such minor changes, might as well just go through them a little quicker. Crystal Snail's left arm is thinner, while the one of the pixels on his right hand changed from a black pixel to a white pixel. Incredible. Alright, closer look. If at any point in time you need to pause to have a better look at the sprites, go ahead and do that if you need to. Alright, Violin. The darker shading on the left side of Violin's arm is disconnected in the prototype. And Violin does look a little bit darker in his color scheme, just a little bit. The chain on Violin's Morningstar is lighter in the early prototype. It was probably darkened to let the player know that they can't actually interact with the chain. Probably to make it look like it's in the background in some ways. Alright, here's a closer look at it where it looks a little brighter here in the prototype, and in the final game / later prototype, it's a bit darker. Since in platformers, making something seem a little darker like it's in the background kind of indicates that you can go through it. Surges. The light under Surge's tank cockpit glows brighter in the final version. It's a little noticeable here. The brightness over here is a little bit dimmer. And here's what it looks like in the final game. Seems to brighten up a little more vigorously and at a higher speed, too. A slightly higher speed. Alright, Agile. Agile's flyer doesn't have those tubes on the side of his body yet, that you can see right over here. Those tubes are likely added to mask the creation of those spiked platforms seen in the later prototype and final game. Don't want to look like they're just spawning out of nowhere. That makes sense, you gotta have immersion there. Instead of it just blipping into existence, you gotta make it look like they're getting out of a machine. I get the idea. But here's a closer look at his early sprite. With his face sticking out, which still looks kind of funny, but whatever. Alright, in the early prototype, Agile's missiles are stored in the sprite set at full size. In the final version, the missiles are stored in a shuriken state, as you can see here, which are then expanded in-game as they get closer to exploding. The early prototype has an extra frame for when the mine is about to explode, while the final version reuses the original tiles, but expands them even more and mushes them closer together to make an X shape. And here's a closer look at the early sprites for this missile. Looks more like a mine to me, but whatever. I mean, then again, it could be a missile coming from the background into the foreground. They could have done something like that. But no, that's not what it's for. And here's the final version. That's more purple instead of red now. Kind of like the red metal, honestly, but whatever. Alright, finally, Sigma Virus. Sigma Virus's wireframe model is very much a work in progress, with more lines in the model and every line being the same color. It looks pretty messy. The final version's colors Sigma Virus's eyes red, and changes Sigma's smirk and chin to match his sprite-based design. And here's what it looks like. Excuse me, just need to drink a little water while you guys look at this. Alright. And here's the final design. Alright, well, that being said, that section is done. Next up to weapons and items. So many differences. Alright, weapons. X-Buster. Charging the X-Buster or any other weapon has no sound effect aligned in the early prototype because the sound effect hadn't been made yet. In the early prototype only, the X-Buster can be charged while the player has no control over X, such as during boss door transitions and boss intros. Yeah, there's a lot of other Classic Series Mega Man games that do that, and some of the X-Series games too, where you can charge in the boss room before you have full control over your character. So it's kind of funny they removed that in some games, but whatever. Later builds remove this feature, which won't be seen until X4, or Mega Man X4. Still the best of the X series, by the way. In the later prototype, if X has a level 1 or 2 charge during a boss intro, and the shot button is not being held while the fight starts, the charge vanishes without firing. That happens in other Mega Man games too. In the final, the charge is fired instantly when the fight starts. Just get a free shot in there, why don't you? In both prototypes, any shot fired while in double shot mode uses the standard charge sound effect. In the final game, any shot fired in double shot mode uses the supercharged sound effect that was used by the Spiral Crush Buster in the first game. Here's a closer look at this. Kinda looks like he's shooting 3 shots than just 2. There's a bug in both prototypes with the double shot system. If the player is on their second shot and they fire, and then quickly jump and cling to a wall, then quickly fire again while on the wall, they'll be able to shoot a third charge shot. Oh, I see why that's there then. If the player does this quickly enough, they'll be able to have 3 charge shots on screen at once. I feel like, well, depending on what part of the game you're in, that could really be a decent exploit to use against certain enemies / bosses. There's a second bug only in the early prototype. Well, I guess that was patched in the final game, so you can't do that, never mind. Alright, only in the early prototype. If the player charges up all the way and fires the first shot while doing a series of short hops, let's go for the shot button. Let's go of the shot button. Charges up all the way again, and then let's go of the fire button again, all while continuing to do short hops. When the player fires the second shot, they'll keep the charging palette until they start charging again. Here's what that looks like. Our palette has already been finalized for Crystal Hunter. Uncharged, this takes 2 shots per unit in both prototypes. 1 shot per unit in the final game. Charged, this takes 3 units per shot in both prototypes and 2 units per shot in the final game. So I guess it just gives them more ammo. In the early prototype, the uncharged shot uses the standard X-Buster sound, while the charged version uses the semi-charged X-Buster sound effect. In the later prototype, the uncharged shot makes the same sound as in the final game, but the charged version recycles the uncharged version's sound effect. And here's another one. The game is supposed to limit the number of Crystal Hunter shots on screen to 3, but in both prototypes, the game doesn't count crystallized enemies as projectiles. There's no effective limit on the number of enemies that can be crystallized at once, as can be seen by freezing the lava orbs in Flame Stag stage. Doesn't really matter though, since there's so few enemies in the game that even take damage from Crystal Hunter, but alright. Here's what that looks like. Also, X's sprite partially vanished. I'm gonna say that's his leg, but I can't really tell. Alright, when an enemy is encased in crystal, and the enemy is still on screen, the player is normally not allowed to switch items using L or R. Switching weapons through the pause menu will despawn the crystal encasement in the enemy. However, there is an oversight in both prototypes. If the player encases an enemy in crystal, then uses a charged Crystal Hunter, and waits for it to run out, they'll be able to switch weapons even with the crystal still on screen. This will lead to the crystal graphics glitching out. If the player destroys the crystallized enemy, they will be unable to switch weapons, again, unless they go through the pause screen. In the early prototype, if the player uses a charged Crystal Hunter, and then goes to the pause menu while the ripple animation is playing and selects a different weapon, both the player and whatever objects that are on screen at the time will be permanently frozen. The player will still be able to charge, but will not be able to fire anything. The only way out is to exit the stage without the pause menu. Another bug in the early prototype, if the game is currently slowed down by a charged Crystal Hunter, and the player goes to a pause menu and selects another weapon, the slowing effect will persist until the player uses another charged Crystal Hunter, which is why that weapon kind of sucks, but whatever. It's kind of supposed to be a time-stopping effect, but it doesn't do that very well. I went over that in my playthrough of Mega Man X2 if you're curious about that. But anyways, Bubble Splash. Alright, this uses a pink and green palette in the early prototypes, and a yellow and dull pink palette in the other versions. Uncharged, this takes 16 bubbles per unit in both prototypes, 8 bubbles per unit in the final game. So I guess it would have effectively doubled his weapon energy had it been 16 bubbles, which I guess that was a little broken. I mean, Bubble Splash isn't that broken of a weapon, but whatever. Would have made it more useful, I think. Charge this takes half as much energy to maintain as it does in the final version. In the early prototype, both charged and uncharged variants use the standard X-Buster sound effect. In the later prototype, sound effects match the ones used in the final game because they actually made said sprites. But here's a closer look at this. For X, this would have been the colors he had he been using Bubble Splash, or been equipped with it. And here's the colors he has in the final game in the later prototypes. I forgot which weapon in X3, I think, no, not Acid Burst, but I forgot which weapon gets this color scheme in X3, I'm pretty sure. Alright, Silk Shot. The other parts of X's armor were turned into mint green in the later builds. Here's a closer look at that. Would have been yellow. I think this is more similar to his color scheme when he has Shining Ray equipped, or Ray Splashers equipped in X3. It's good to know what that was used for. I like this color scheme a bit more. Green is an overall better color, I'd say. My favorite color, for those of you who don't know, but yes. In the early prototypes, the palette of the crystal version of Silkshot is corrupted. The second darkest shade of blue is much darker than it should be, and what would be the darkest shade of blue is an odd green color. All forms take the same amount of energy in all three versions. And no sound effect in either prototype, likely hasn't been made yet. The X-Hunter stage incorrectly uses the rock version of Silkshot instead of the scrap version, and here's what that looks like. Spin Wheel uses the same palette in all versions. Uncharged, this takes 4 shots per unit in both prototypes, 2 shots per unit in the final game, effectively having its weapon usage. Charged version takes the same amount of energy in all 3 builds, no sound effect in either prototype. Sonic Slicer. The purple and pink palettes turned into blue and orange later on. Here's what that looks like. I think this color scheme's a little better for this particular weapon. One of the turning frames for the charged Sonic Slicer is incorrectly colored in both prototypes, this yellowish color. Uncharged, this takes 1 shot per unit in both prototypes and 2 shots per unit in the final game. Charged versions take the same amount of energy in all versions. In the early prototype, the uncharged shot uses the standard X-Buster sound, while the charged version uses the semi-charged X-Buster sound effect. In the later prototype, the uncharged shot makes a firing sound, but there is no sound for clinking off walls. The charged version has a placeholder sound, a short, high-pitched beep. Here's what that looks like. Here's what it looks like in the final game. Alright, Strike Chain uses the same palette in all versions. While uncharged, if the chain doesn't strike an enemy, it takes 16 exclamation point shots per unit in the prototype and 2 shots per unit in the final game. I guess that might have been an error, or they just wanted to see how the weapon consumption for it would have worked. While charged, if the chain doesn't strike an enemy, this takes 8 shots per unit in the prototype and 2 shots per unit in the final game. In the early prototypes, both uncharged and charged shots are silent. So maybe it was initially going to have much more weapon consumption or something, or weapon energy, and that's why its weapon consumption is so high. I'm not entirely sure. In the prototype version before it was changed in the final game. If the later prototype, the uncharged shot is still silent, while the charged version uses the semi-charged X-Buster sound effect. If the charged version makes contact with an enemy, and it doesn't instantly destroy that enemy, it depletes about 2 units of energy every 2 frames of contact. This was thankfully reduced to 1/8 of an energy unit per 2 frames of contact in the final version. The strike chain can grab heart and sub-tanks in both prototypes. Unfortunately, the palettes for those items are only meant to be loaded in specific areas, so bringing them out of those areas will lead to glitched color schemes like the ones on the right. Which is why that was probably changed in the final game, to not be able to grab heart tanks or sub-tanks. But it's cool that they would be able to do that, but it wouldn't be very practical either, since they're only in specific parts of each given stage. And it is a little glitched over here, as you can see. So they likely just change it to where you can't do that in the final game. Alright, Magnet Mine. The palettes of Magnet Mine and Speedburner are swapped in the early prototypes. So Speedburner was originally going to be gray and yellow? Why? Whatever, this is a better color scheme for it. That would have been used for Magna Mine, which is funny. And here's what we got in the final game. A much better color scheme akin to Thunder Beam for Mega Man 1 or Thunder Wolf for Mega Man 10. Though the graphics as they appear in-game are identical between the versions, the stored graphics are different as the result of a change which shuffled the colors in Magna Mine's palette around. The reason for this change is the weapon energy meter. In the prototype, the bar's dark gray palette matches the empty bar palette. The final game changes the bar from a gray color to yellow. Like this one, the yellow color scheme looks a little better in my opinion. Uncharged, this takes 4 shots per unit in both prototypes, 1 shot per unit in the final game. In Charged, this takes 24 units of energy per shot, yes really, in both prototypes, and 3 units per shot in the final game. They probably thought that'd be a way to balance it out, or again, just to test how it works. In both prototypes, the uncharged version uses the X-Buster shot sound effect, while the charged version uses the semi-X-Buster sound effect. Uncharged Magna Mine that sticks to a solid surface will only explode if an enemy makes contact with them in the final game. They'll explode on their own after about a second. And here's a closer look at the prototype one where it's gray. In the final game, it's yellow. Just like the rest of the weapons. Alright, Speedburner, we saw this earlier. It would have initially had this yellow and gray color scheme, which I don't think fits a fire-themed weapon. And we got this one in the final game. The palettes for Magna Mine and Speedburner are swapped in the early prototypes. As previously stated, pay attention. Yeah, I know, they're paying attention, so am I. Alright, the Uncharged Speedburner uses a different sprite in the early prototype. And the final version looks like it would do a bit more damage and looks like it's spinning a bit faster. Uncharged, it takes 4 shots per unit in both prototypes, 1 shot per unit in the final game. Charged version takes the same amount of energy in all versions. In the early prototype, the unchanged shot, or charged shot, uses the standard X-Buster sound, while the charged version uses the semi-charged X-Buster sound. In the later prototype, sound effects match those in the final game, and here's what that looks like. It looks like it would also hit a little more vertically upward too, rather than horizontally like the prototype version. At Giga Crush, charging up has no sound effect in either prototype, but the energy wave does. Probably because that sound effect, the first sound effect, wasn't made yet. In the prototypes, this works on enemies the same way it works on bosses, dealing continuous damage every frame, invincibility permitting. For about 96 frames in the final game, the amount of damage that Giga Crush does to normal enemies and sub-bosses per frame does set so high that it destroys them instantly. Oof! Because it is a screen nuke after all. In the early prototype, if X is in the middle using the Giga Crush, the player can still pause the game, leading to a few glitches. If the player is currently absorbing energy and then pauses, the foreground layers will disappear until the attack ends. So it kind of looks like there's no platforms here. Closer look at that. Alright, switching weapons in the middle of the Giga Crush will corrupt the light beam graphics, and here's what that looks like. If you switch to Magna Mine, you get a bunch of Magna Mine sprites. Kind of makes sense that would happen, actually, so they likely disabled being able to change weapons in the middle of that animation. If X is crushed by an object while using the Giga Crush, his health is set to 0, but he'll stay alive until the Giga Crush sequence is complete. And here's what that looks like. He's also through the platform. And he probably had just gotten the light capsule too, judging by the tunnel he's in. If the player hits a boss shutter and uses the Giga Crush in the same frame, they'll be pushed through the door before the shutter opens. The boss graphics will load over the shutter graphics, and glitching them out. And here's what that looks like. Alright, and the glitched out boss shutter right over here, with the Giga Crush animation. After the Giga Crush animation ends, the player will regain control of X and will be able to move around during the boss intro. The bosses themselves don't have their collision set until their intro ends, so X and his shots will pass right through them. Here's a closer look at that. The item tracer. This is called Search R. Search R question mark in the weapons menu. No sound effect in either prototype. Hotspots have only been programmed for Morthmoth's stage at this point. The Shoryuken. This doesn't exist at all in the older prototypes and it's unobtainable in the newer builds. Use Pro Action Replay PAR code, this code over here, to activate it. X doesn't have to be at full HP to use this yet. It just wasn't coded in yet, it looks like. If X is in the middle of doing the Shoryuken and the player goes to a weapon select screen and selects a different weapon, once the player lands, the X Buster palette will be loaded over a weapon palette. Over that weapon palette. The final game fixes this in a pretty obvious way. The player can no longer pause the game while using the Shoryuken. While doing the Shoryuken, here's what that looks like. A greenish-blue speed burner actually looks pretty badass. I like that. Right armor and right cycle. If the player uses the Giga Crush such that the animation pushes them into a right armor or right cycle, they'll enter the vehicle in a glitch state. Every time they turn or jump in either vehicle while performing a Giga Crush, they do another Giga Crush. This can be done an infinite number of times until the Giga Crush sequence is finally allowed to play out all the way, which sounds pretty fucking broken, so I'm glad they patched that out. After the final Giga Crush ends, X's sprites will become offset from the vehicle. And here's what that looks like. X, you're not sitting in the thing properly. You might fall out of it. And notice how his legs are kind of cut off here? Because you're not supposed to normally be able to see his legs or anything below his arms here. Says there'd be no need to even code that in. And he's definitely not riding that correctly here. You'll fall off. X, safety first, dude. Don't they have safety in the future? Yes, they do. But anyways, light capsule. Finally, the light capsule. If the player approaches a light capsule with a special weapon selected, then fires a weapon after seeing the Dr. Light cutscene but before entering the capsule proper, their weapon's graphics will be glitched. This doesn't seem to happen with every weapon, but the Speed Burner and Giga Crush are noticeably affected, and here's what that looks like. And the walls here are glitched out too, after he's using Speed Burner. Alright, well, with that being said, we are not done just yet. In part 6 of Mega Man X2 Unused content, we'll go over the debug features. So, if y'all enjoyed this and want to see more, please leave a like, comment, subscribe. And answer the question today as usual, what unused content did we go over that we went over in today's video would you have liked to see in the final game? For me, I'd say some of these sprite changes being in the final game, especially some of the more minuscule ones, would have been cool to see unchanged, as well as these Tyranno sprites all being used, but maybe they had some sort of different ability with them to, warrant the different color change. That's what I would have liked to see in the final game. But anyways, thank you all for watching, see you on part 6, and have a perfect day.